The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Bennett's penthouse office, each drop a reminder of how far he'd fallen. Once, those same windows had offered him a view of his empire, a sprawling tech campus in Lower Manhattan, where 3,000 employees had worked around the clock to build the future. Now all he could see were the empty parking lots and the 4 lease signs that had multiplied like a disease across his former kingdom. Marcus loosened his tie and rubbed his temples, staring at the stack of legal documents that seemed to multiply every time he looked away. Bankruptcy papers, custody evaluations, foreclosure notices. His life had become a mountain of paperwork, documenting his spectacular fall from grace. "Daddy!" A small voice broke through his thoughts. Emma stood in the doorway of his home office, clutching her stuffed rabbit with one arm, while the other held a juice box that was leaking onto the Persian rug. At 5 years old, she had her mother's dark eyes and his stubborn chin, but lately she'd developed a hesitant way of approaching him, as if she wasn't sure she was welcome. "What is it, sweetheart?" Marcus tried to keep the exhaustion out of his voice as he stood up, grabbing tissues from his desk to clean up the spill. "I'm hungry," she said quietly, "and Mrs. Rodriguez isn't here anymore." Marcus's jaw tightened. Mrs. Rodriguez, their housekeeper of 8 years, had quit yesterday when her paycheck started bouncing. She'd been kind about it, even offered to stay without pay for Emma's sake, but Marcus's pride wouldn't allow it. He couldn't ask someone to work for free just because he'd managed to destroy everything he'd built. "I know, baby, we'll figure something out." He knelt down to clean the juice from the rug, noticing how Emma flinched slightly when he moved too quickly. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His own daughter was afraid of him, not because he'd ever hurt her, but because he'd become a stranger in their own home. When had he last read her a bedtime story? When had he last asked about her day at kindergarten? The demands of trying to save his company had consumed him so completely that he'd barely noticed his daughter growing up. And now, with bankruptcy looming and his wife's family threatening to take Emma away, he was running out of time to fix everything. His phone buzzed on the desk. Another call from his lawyer, probably with more bad news about the custody hearing scheduled for next month. Marcus ignored it and focused on Emma, who was now sitting cross-legged on the carpet, organizing her crayons by color with the kind of meticulous attention that reminded him painfully of Catherine. "How about we order pizza?" he suggested, though he wasn't sure his credit cards would work. "We can eat it in the living room and watch that movie about the princess." Emma's face lit up for the first time in weeks. "Really? On the couch?" "On the couch," Marcus confirmed, smiling despite everything. Maybe he'd lost his company. Maybe he was about to lose his home, but he still had his daughter. For now, that had to be enough. As they walked to the living room together, Marcus made a silent promise. Whatever it took, however impossible it seemed, he would find a way to keep Emma safe and happy. He just had no idea that help was about to arrive in the most unexpected form. The employment agency's waiting room smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Marcus sat in an uncomfortable chair, watching a parade of potential nannies come and go, while Emma colored quietly beside him. 3 interviews so far, and each one had been a disaster. The first woman had taken one look at the address and asked about overtime pay before even meeting Emma. The second had spent the entire interview on her phone. The third had lectured him about his daughter's concerning behavior because Emma hadn't wanted to talk to a complete stranger. "Mr. Bennett?" The receptionist's voice cut through his growing frustration. "Your 4 o'clock appointment is here." Marcus looked up to see a woman in her early 30s, approaching with the kind of confident stride that suggested she was used to being in control. She was professionally dressed in a navy blazer and slacks, her black hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. What struck him most were her eyes, sharp and observant, taking in everything about him and Emma in a single glance. "Sarah Chen," she said, extending her hand with a firm shake. "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice." There was something immediately calming about her presence. Emma, who had been suspicious of every other candidate, looked up from her coloring book with genuine curiosity instead of the usual wariness. "Please, have a seat," Marcus said, gesturing to the chair across from them. "I have to admit your resume is impressive. Harvard MBA, fluent in 4 languages, experience with high-profile families. I'm curious why you're interested in this position." Sarah smiled, and Marcus noticed it reached her eyes in a way that felt genuine. "I believe in helping families during difficult transitions. Sometimes the most rewarding work comes from the most challenging situations. She turned to Emma, crouching down to the child's eye level. "That's a beautiful drawing. Are those flowers?" "They're for my mommy," Emma said softly. "She's in heaven, but Daddy says she can still see them if I draw them really bright." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd told Emma that months ago, during one of their rare conversations about Catherine's death, but he hadn't realized she'd taken it so literally. "I think she can see them too," Sarah said seriously, "and I think she'd love how you made each petal a different color. That takes real artistic skill." Emma beamed and Marcus watched in amazement as his shy, withdrawn daughter began chattering about her artwork. Within minutes, Sarah had Emma laughing about something, the sound so rare and precious that Marcus felt his throat close up. "Emma, why don't you show Sarah your books while I ask her a few questions?" Marcus suggested. As Emma ran off to fetch her favorite stories, Marcus studied Sarah more carefully. "Your references are impeccable, but I have to ask, this job isn't exactly what someone with your qualifications usually pursues. Why the career change?" For just a moment, something flickered across Sarah's face, too quick for him to identify, but it suggested there was more to her story than her polished exterior revealed. "I've spent my career solving complex problems," she said carefully. "Lately, I've realized that the most important problems aren't always the ones that make headlines. Sometimes they're much more personal." Emma returned with an armload of books, and Sarah listened patiently as the little girl explained the intricate plot lines of several picture books. Marcus found himself relaxing for the first time in months, watching his daughter's animated gestures and bright smile. "Mr. Bennett," Sarah said eventually, "I should be direct with you. I know about your company's situation. I know you're facing financial difficulties and a custody evaluation. What I want you to understand is that none of that changes my interest in this position. Emma needs stability and consistency right now, and that's exactly what I can provide." Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of pity or judgment, but found only professional confidence. "The salary we discussed, I should mention that it might be delayed sometimes, until things stabilize." "I'm not concerned about that," Sarah said simply. "What I'm concerned about is making sure Emma feels secure while you work through these challenges. From what I can see, you love your daughter very much, but you're trying to handle everything alone. You don't have to." Something in her tone, not just professional but genuinely caring, made Marcus's decision easy. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow, if you'd like. I believe in jumping in when a family needs help." As they shook hands again, Marcus felt the first stirring of hope he'd experienced in months. He had no idea that Sarah Chen was about to change his life in ways he couldn't imagine, or that her real reasons for taking this job were far more complicated than either of them could admit. Sarah arrived at the penthouse at 7:30 sharp, carrying a leather bag that looked more like a briefcase than a typical nanny's tote. Marcus answered the door in yesterday's wrinkled shirt, his hair disheveled and dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd spent another sleepless night wrestling with financial projections and legal documents. "Rough night?" Sarah asked, stepping into the marble foyer with the kind of quiet efficiency that didn't disturb the morning stillness. "Is it that obvious?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, suddenly self-conscious. "Emma's still asleep. She usually gets up around 8, but lately she's been having nightmares. I think the stress is affecting her more than I realized." Sarah set her bag down and studied him with those sharp eyes. "When did you last have a full night's sleep?" The question caught Marcus off guard. When was the last time someone had asked about his well-being instead of his company's stock price or his legal troubles? "I honestly can't remember. Maybe before Catherine got sick. That was 2 years ago, Mr. Bennett." "Marcus," he corrected automatically. "And yes, I know it sounds impossible, but running a company while your wife is dying, then trying to hold everything together afterward." He trailed off, realizing he was sharing more than he'd intended with someone who was essentially still a stranger. "You don't have to explain," Sarah said gently, "but you should know that Emma is watching you constantly. Children are remarkably perceptive about their parents' emotional state. If you're barely holding on, she knows it, and it makes her feel unsafe." The observation stung because it was accurate. Marcus had noticed how Emma seemed to tiptoe around him lately, how she'd started asking if he was okay with the worried expression of someone far too young to carry such concerns. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted. "I'm trying to save what's left of the company, deal with lawyers, prepare for a custody hearing, and be a father. I feel like I'm failing at everything." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Marcus wondered if he'd said too much. But when she spoke, her voice held an unexpected warmth. "You're not failing, Marcus. You're drowning. And there's a difference. The good news is that drowning people can be taught to swim." Before he could ask what she meant, the soft patter of small feet announced Emma's arrival. She appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and looking uncertainly between Marcus and Sarah. "Good morning, Emma," Sarah called up with a bright smile. "I love your pajamas." "Are those astronauts?" Emma nodded shyly, coming down the stairs one careful step at a time. "They're going to the moon." "That's very brave of them. Do you think they get scared, going so far from home?" Emma considered this seriously. "Maybe a little, but they have each other, so it's okay." Sarah glanced at Marcus with a meaningful look. "That's very wise. Having someone you trust makes even scary things manageable." As Sarah helped Emma with breakfast, Marcus found himself actually watching his daughter instead of multitasking with phone calls and emails. Emma was more animated than he'd seen her in months, chattering about her dreams of becoming an astronaut, while Sarah listened with genuine interest and asked thoughtful questions. "Daddy used to build rockets," Emma announced proudly. "Before Mummy got sick." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd forgotten about the model rockets they'd built together when Emma was 3, simple kits that had sparked her fascination with space, another casualty of his single-minded focus on keeping the company afloat. "Maybe we could build another one sometime," he said carefully. Emma's face lit up. "Really? With the kind that actually flies?" "If Sarah doesn't mind rocket launches in Central Park," Marcus said, surprised by his own willingness to make plans beyond surviving the next crisis. "I think that sounds like an excellent adventure," Sarah said, and something in her tone suggested she meant it. As Marcus headed to his office to prepare for another day of damage control, he overheard Sarah asking Emma about her favorite books and her best friends at school. Normal questions that any good nanny would ask, but Marcus noticed she listened to the answers with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for important business meetings. For the first time in 2 years, Marcus left for work without worrying about what kind of chaos he might return to. He had no idea that Sarah was already conducting her own investigation, or that the woman making his daughter laugh over pancakes was simultaneously memorizing the layout of his home and noting the security vulnerabilities that could be exploited by people far more dangerous than bankruptcy lawyers. Marcus returned home that evening to find his penthouse transformed. Not physically. Sarah wasn't the type to rearrange someone else's furniture, but the atmosphere itself felt different, lighter somehow. The oppressive weight of stress and sorrow that had settled over their home like fog seemed to have lifted, replaced by something Marcus had almost forgotten, the sound of his daughter's laughter. He found them in Emma's room, where Sarah was helping her organize an elaborate tea party for her stuffed animals. Each toy had been assigned a specific role and personality, and Emma was explaining their complex relationships with the kind of detail that suggested this had been going on for hours. "Mr. Rabbit is the doctor because he's very gentle," Emma was saying seriously, "and Princess Bear is the queen, but she's also nice to everyone, not scary like the queen in some stories." "That sounds like a very good queen to have," Sarah replied. "What about Captain Lion? What's his job?" "He protects everyone, like how Daddy used to protect our company before the bad people took it away." Marcus froze in the doorway. Emma had never spoken so directly about his business troubles before. He'd tried to shield her from the worst of it, but clearly she understood more than he'd realized. Sarah noticed him standing there and gave him a subtle nod before turning back to Emma. "Sometimes protecting people is very hard work. Even good people like your daddy can face situations that are bigger than they expected." "But he won't give up," Emma said with fierce certainty. "Daddy never gives up. Mommy told me so." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Catherine had said something similar during her final weeks, when he'd been ready to abandon the company entirely to spend more time with her. She'd insisted he keep fighting, not just for their financial security, but because she believed in his vision of technology that could help people. "You're right," Sarah said quietly. "Your daddy is a fighter, and fighters sometimes need help, which is why I'm here." As they cleaned up the tea party supplies, Marcus marveled at how naturally Sarah moved through their evening routine. She seemed to anticipate Emma's needs before they were voiced, redirecting potential tantrums with distraction techniques that looked effortless but were clearly the result of extensive experience. After Emma was tucked into bed with a story about brave astronauts exploring distant planets, Marcus and Sarah sat in his living room with coffee that was actually hot, a luxury he'd forgotten existed since Mrs. Rodriguez left. "She's a remarkable little girl," Sarah said, settling into the leather chair across from his couch. "Intelligent, observant, remarkably resilient considering everything she's been through. She gets that from her mother," Marcus said. "Catherine was the strongest person I ever knew. Even when she was dying, she was making plans, trying to make sure Emma and I would be okay without her. And what would she think about how you're handling things now?" The question was asked gently, but it still stung. Marcus stared into his coffee cup, seeing his own reflection wavering in the dark liquid. "She'd probably tell me I'm being an idiot. Catherine never had patience for self-pity. She sounds like a smart woman. What do you think she'd want you to do?" "Fight smarter, not just harder." The words came out before Marcus had fully formed the thought. "She always said I had a tendency to charge straight at problems instead of thinking strategically. You're brilliant at building things, Marcus, but terrible at protecting them." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "What would protecting your company look like, strategically speaking?" Marcus found himself talking about things he hadn't discussed with anyone. His suspicions about the timing of certain board decisions, the convenient way his former business partner, James Morrison, had positioned himself to acquire key assets, the mysterious investors who had appeared just as his company began to crumble. "I built that company from nothing," he said, surprised by the anger in his own voice. 15 years of my life, and in 6 months it just disappeared. No one loses that much money that quickly through simple mismanagement. You think someone orchestrated your downfall? I think James Morrison has wanted control of my patents and research data for years. I just can't prove it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. When she spoke, her voice carried a new quality, something sharper and more focused than the warm Nanny persona she'd shown all day. "What if you could prove it? Then I'd have a chance at getting my company back, maybe even keep Emma." Marcus looked up at her, struck by something in her tone. "Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and sometimes the people who think they've won have gotten careless about covering their tracks." There was something in Sarah's eyes that reminded Marcus of Catherine, that same fierce intelligence, the look of someone who could see angles and possibilities that others missed. For a moment, he wondered who Sarah Chen really was, and what had brought someone with her obvious capabilities to work as a nanny for a bankrupt CEO. But before he could ask, she was standing up, the moment of sharpness replaced by professional courtesy. "I should let you get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow is another day, and Emma will need both of us at our best." As Marcus watched her gather her things, he had the strangest feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. What he didn't know was that Sarah Chen had already begun implementing a plan that would either save his family or destroy them all. Sarah waited until Marcus left for his lawyer's office before she began her real work. Emma was absorbed in building an elaborate castle out of blocks in the living room, chattering happily to her stuffed animals about the royal ball they would host that evening. The child's contentment gave Sarah the perfect cover to explore. She started with Marcus's home office, moving through the space with the systematic precision of someone trained to gather intelligence without leaving traces. His desk was a chaos of legal documents, financial statements, and printed emails, the paper trail of a man desperately trying to understand how his empire had crumbled so quickly. Sarah photographed key documents with a camera disguised as a pen, her trained eye immediately identifying patterns that Marcus, consumed by panic and grief, had missed. The timeline was too convenient, the financial losses too precisely targeted. Someone had definitely orchestrated this collapse, but the evidence was buried beneath layers of legitimate business transactions and legal maneuvering. "Sarah," Emma's voice came from the doorway. "What are you doing in Daddy's office?" Sarah didn't startle. Years of training had taught her to maintain perfect composure even when caught off guard. She turned with a warm smile, slipping the camera pen into her pocket with a motion so natural it looked like she was simply adjusting her blazer. "I was looking for paper to help you make invitations for your royal ball," she said smoothly. "Your daddy has lots of important papers, but I don't see any pretty ones for parties." Emma accepted this explanation without question, taking Sarah's hand to lead her back to the living room. "We can use my art supplies instead. I have sparkly paper." As they worked on elaborate invitations decorated with Emma's careful drawings of castles and crowns, Sarah's mind processed what she'd seen in Marcus's office. The financial records painted a clear picture of systematic sabotage, but proving it would require access to information that Marcus didn't have. Internal communications from his former company, banking records from the mysterious investors, and detailed analysis of the timing of each financial blow. Fortunately, Sarah had resources that Marcus didn't. That afternoon, while Emma napped, Sarah made a secure phone call from the penthouse's roof garden, where the city noise would mask her conversation from any potential surveillance. "It's Chen," she said when the encrypted line connected. "Report," came the clipped voice of Director Hayes, her former handler at the CIA. "I'm in position. The target is cooperative, but unaware of the operation. The child is—" Sarah paused, watching through the glass doors as Emma slept peacefully on the couch, her small hand still clutching a crayon. "The collateral situation is more complex than anticipated." "Explain." "Bennett isn't just a victim of corporate espionage. He's been deliberately isolated and destabilized. Someone wanted him vulnerable and desperate. The question is whether that someone is working with our international targets, or if this is an unrelated domestic operation that we're interfering with. Your job is to determine Bennett's involvement in the money laundering operation, not to play detective with his business problems." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "Director, I don't think Bennett is involved in money laundering. I think he's being set up to take the fall for it." "Evidence?" "The financial patterns are too clean. Real criminals leave messier trails. This looks like someone wanted to create a perfect target, a desperate businessman facing bankruptcy who could plausibly be involved in international financial crimes." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Hayes spoke again, his voice carried a warning edge. "Agent Chen, you retired from active duty after your last mission because you became emotionally compromised. Don't make the same mistake twice." Sarah stared out at the Manhattan skyline, remembering the mission in Prague that had ended her career. The family she'd been meant to protect who had died because she'd trusted the wrong person. "This is different. It's always different. Complete your assessment of Bennett and report back in 72 hours. And Chen, remember that your job is to serve national security interests, not to save one man's family." The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of her conflicting loyalties. Below in the apartment, Emma was waking up from her nap, calling sleepily for Miss Sarah. The sound tugged at something in Sarah's chest that she'd thought she'd buried with her career. She'd taken this assignment because she owed Hayes a favor, and because 3 months of retirement had been driving her slowly insane. "A simple surveillance job," he'd said. "Assess whether a bankrupt CEO was involved in laundering money for international criminals. Easy work for someone with her skills." But nothing about Marcus Bennett or his daughter was simple. Emma had already wrapped herself around Sarah's heart with the kind of trusting affection that Sarah had never experienced. And Marcus was a good man drowning in circumstances beyond his control, not a criminal mastermind hiding behind family tragedy. The problem was that someone clearly wanted the government to believe otherwise. The question was who, and why they'd gone to such elaborate lengths to destroy an honest man's life. As Sarah headed back inside to help Emma with an afternoon snack, she made a decision that would have horrified her former colleagues. She was going to find out who was really behind the conspiracy against Marcus Bennett, and if that meant going against her orders and risking her own safety, then so be it. Some things were more important than following orders. Some families were worth protecting, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. Marcus returned home that evening, looking like a man who'd been hit by a truck. His meeting with the lawyers had gone even worse than expected. The custody evaluation had been moved up, and Catherine's parents were bringing in their own legal team to challenge his fitness as a father. Sarah took one look at his defeated expression and made an executive decision. "Emma, why don't you show your daddy the royal ball preparations while I make dinner? I think he needs to see something beautiful right now." Emma grabbed Marcus's hand with the enthusiasm only a 5-year-old could muster after a full day of creative projects. "Daddy, look! We made a whole kingdom in the living room, and everyone gets to be whatever they want to be." Marcus allowed himself to be led to the living room, where Sarah and Emma had indeed constructed an elaborate fantasy world using furniture, blankets, and every pillow in the apartment. Stuffed animals sat at a long dining table made from the coffee table, each wearing paper crowns and seated on cushions like nobility at a medieval feast. "This is incredible, Emma," Marcus said. And for the first time in weeks, Sarah heard genuine wonder in his voice, instead of the careful enthusiasm he usually forced for his daughter's benefit. "How did you build all this?" "Sarah helped, but she said all the best ideas were mine," Emma said proudly. "She's really good at building things, just like you used to be." Marcus glanced at Sarah over Emma's head, and she saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that she'd given his daughter something he'd been unable to provide lately: joy and imagination, and the freedom to be a child. During dinner, Emma regaled them with detailed stories about each of her stuffed animal subjects, complete with complex backstories and political relationships that would have impressed a fantasy novelist. Marcus found himself laughing for the first time in months, and Sarah watched him transform from the exhausted, defeated man who'd walked through the door into someone who remembered how to be a father. After Emma was in bed, Marcus and Sarah sat in the kitchen over coffee that had become their evening ritual. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly. "I haven't seen her that happy since before Catherine got sick. I'd forgotten what her real laugh sounds like. She's a remarkable child. She has your creativity and your mother's strength. You never knew Catherine." Sarah realized her mistake immediately. She'd been thinking of the psychological profile in Emma's file, not the information she should naturally have. "I can see it in Emma," she said carefully. "Children carry the best of both parents." Marcus accepted this explanation, but Sarah noticed him studying her more carefully. She needed to be more cautious about revealing knowledge she shouldn't have. "Marcus," she said, changing the subject to safer ground, "you mentioned your former business partner yesterday, James Morrison. What's your relationship with him now?" Marcus's expression darkened. "Non-existent, officially. But James has a way of staying involved in my business even after our partnership ended. He seems remarkably well informed about my financial situation. Have you considered that he might be more involved in your problems than you realize?" "I've considered it. But James is smart enough to keep his hands clean. If he wanted to destroy me, he'd do it in a way that couldn't be traced back to him." Sarah leaned forward. "What if I told you there might be a way to find proof?" Marcus set down his coffee cup, his full attention focused on her. "What kind of proof?" "Digital evidence. Financial records, communications, metadata from transactions. The kind of evidence that exists even when people think they've covered their tracks." "You're talking about hacking." "I'm talking about investigation techniques that law enforcement uses every day, the same kind of analysis that white-collar crime units employ to uncover financial fraud." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. "You seem to know a lot about this kind of investigation, more than I'd expect from someone with a background in childcare and family services." Sarah felt the weight of his scrutiny and realized she'd reached a decision point. She could continue the charade and maintain her cover, or she could take a calculated risk and give Marcus a partial truth that might help them both. "I haven't always worked with families," she said carefully. "I used to work in corporate security and risk assessment. I understand how financial crimes work because I used to help prevent them." It wasn't entirely a lie. CIA operatives did work in corporate security, and she had extensive training in financial analysis and fraud detection. But it was far from the whole truth. Marcus absorbed this information, and Sarah could see him recalibrating his understanding of who she was. "Corporate security for what kind of companies?" "The kind that have international operations and face complex threats. The kind that need people who can think like criminals in order to stay ahead of them." "And you gave that up to become a nanny?" Sarah met his eyes directly. "I gave it up because I realized that protecting one family well was more important to me than protecting 100 companies badly." The truth of that statement surprised her. When had Emma and Marcus become more important to her than her career or her mission? When had she started thinking of this as her family instead of her assignment? "If I said yes," Marcus said slowly, "if I asked for your help investigating James and the people who destroyed my company, what would that mean? What would we be risking?" "We'd be risking everything," Sarah said honestly. "But Marcus, I think you're already about to lose everything anyway. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all." Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city lights. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a determination Sarah hadn't heard before. "Then let's do it. Let's find out who really destroyed my company and why, and let's make them pay for what they've done to my family." Sarah nodded, knowing that she'd just committed herself to a course of action that would put her in direct conflict with her orders and potentially destroy her career. But as she thought of Emma sleeping peacefully in her room and Marcus's newfound determination to fight for his family, she realized she didn't care. Some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the consequences. Sarah's investigation began in earnest the next morning, while Marcus attended a deposition and Emma was at kindergarten. She'd spent the night analyzing the financial documents she'd photographed, cross-referencing them with databases she technically no longer had access to, but whose security protocols she still knew by heart. What she found made her blood run cold. The money laundering operation Director Hayes suspected wasn't Marcus's crime. It was the weapon being used to destroy him. Someone had been systematically funneling dirty money through shell companies that appeared to be connected to Marcus's business dealings, creating a paper trail that would implicate him in international financial crimes while simultaneously bankrupting his legitimate operations. It was an elegant frame job, the kind of sophisticated operation that required resources, expertise, and connections at the highest levels of both legitimate business and criminal organizations. The question was, who had the capability and motivation to orchestrate such an elaborate conspiracy? Sarah's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Director Hayes. Status report required. Asset compromised. She stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, investigation ongoing. Situation more complex than briefed. Report to Safe House. 1400 hours. Come alone. Sarah deleted the message chain and checked her watch. She had 4 hours before she'd have to explain to her former handler why she hadn't completed her assessment of Marcus Bennett and why she was now convinced he was innocent of the charges being prepared against him. She spent those 4 hours conducting her own investigation, using skills and resources she'd hoped never to need again. What she discovered made her realize that Marcus and Emma weren't just victims of corporate sabotage. They were pawns in a much larger game. The Safe House was a nondescript apartment in Brooklyn, the kind of place that looked like every other middle-class home on the block, but was equipped with enough surveillance equipment to monitor half the city. Director Hayes was waiting for her with coffee and the kind of grim expression that suggested this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "You missed your deadline," he said without preamble. "I needed more time to verify my findings." "Your findings should have been simple. Is Marcus Bennett involved in international money laundering, yes or no?" Sarah sat down across from him, choosing her words carefully. "He's involved, but not in the way you think. Someone is using his company's financial collapse to launder money and create evidence that will implicate him in crimes he didn't commit." Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of analytical attention she remembered from her training days. "You're emotionally compromised. I'm professionally thorough. The financial patterns are wrong, Director. Real money laundering operations don't leave such convenient evidence trails. Someone wanted Marcus to look guilty. Who? I'm still working on that, but I have a theory." Sarah spread out printed financial documents on the table between them, documents she'd obtained through methods that Hayes wouldn't approve of but wouldn't question too closely. "Look at the timing," she said, pointing to highlighted sections. "Every major financial blow to Marcus's company happened within days of specific intelligence reports about international money laundering investigations. Someone with access to classified information was timing the destruction of his business to coincide with our investigation." Hayes studied the documents, his expression unreadable. "You're suggesting someone within the intelligence community is involved. I'm suggesting someone with access to our intelligence is coordinating with criminals to frame an innocent man. The question is why? Maybe because he's not innocent." Sarah pulled out another set of documents, bank records she'd accessed through contacts who owed her favors from her active duty days. "These are the real money laundering transactions. Notice anything?" Hayes scanned the records, and Sarah watched his expression change as he recognized the pattern. The money is being cleaned through legitimate investments in tech companies, companies that Marcus Bennett's former business partner, James Morrison, has been acquiring at below-market prices. "Morrison isn't just buying distressed assets," Sarah said. "He's creating distressed assets by coordinating with international criminals to destroy his competition. Then he's helping them launder money through the companies he acquires. And Marcus Bennett is being set up to take the fall when this operation eventually gets exposed, a desperate, bankrupt CEO facing custody battles and criminal charges. He's the perfect scapegoat." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Sarah recognized from their most serious operations. If you're right, this goes deeper than corporate espionage. We're talking about a network that includes legitimate business leaders, international criminal organizations, and possibly compromised intelligence assets. Which means Marcus and his daughter are in more danger than they realize. And it means I need to stay in position to protect them. Sarah, you're retired. You don't have authorization for an active operation. Then give me authorization. Hayes studied her face, and Sarah knew he was weighing her request against protocols, politics, and the kind of complex calculations that made intelligence work as much art as science. What do you need? He asked finally. Time, resources, and permission to run a full investigation into James Morrison and his financial network, and backup in case this situation turns dangerous. You'll have it. But Sarah, this time you follow orders. No freelancing, no emotional decisions. If I tell you to extract, you extract, even if it means leaving the family behind. Sarah nodded, knowing she was lying. She'd already made her choice about what mattered most, and it wasn't following orders. As she left the safe house, Sarah realized she was walking into the most dangerous mission of her career, but for the first time since Prague, she felt like she was fighting for something that truly mattered. Size to Monsieur Marcus was playing chess with Emma when Sarah returned to the penthouse that evening, both of them sprawled on the living room carpet with the board between them. Emma was winning, her small face scrunched in concentration as she considered her next move. Sarah, Emma called without looking up from the game, Daddy's teaching me strategy. He says good strategy means thinking about what your opponent might do before they do it. That's very wise advice, Sarah said, settling onto the couch to watch their game. Your daddy is very good at strategy. Not good enough, apparently, Marcus said ruefully, as Emma moved her queen to put his king in check. I think I'm being outmaneuvered by a 5-year-old. Sarah watched them play, noting how much more relaxed Marcus seemed compared to the previous evening. Emma's laughter filled the apartment, and for a moment Sarah allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if this were really her life. If she really were just a nanny helping a loving father rebuild his relationship with his daughter. But the weight of the intelligence she'd gathered that afternoon reminded her that this peaceful moment was built on a foundation of lies and danger. James Morrison wasn't just a greedy business partner. He was part of a sophisticated criminal network that had already destroyed Marcus's company and was now positioning him to take the fall for international crimes. After Emma was in bed, Sarah and Marcus settled into their usual evening routine in the kitchen, but tonight Sarah had news that would change everything. I found something, she said without preamble, about James Morrison and what happened to your company. Marcus set down his coffee cup, his full attention focused on her. What kind of something? Sarah pulled out a tablet loaded with financial documents, knowing she was about to reveal far more about her capabilities than her cover story could explain. I was able to access some financial records through my old contacts in corporate security. Marcus, James Morrison isn't just taking advantage of your company's collapse. He orchestrated it. She showed him the documents she'd compiled, walking him through the complex web of shell companies, timed investments, and coordinated attacks on his business. This is incredible, Marcus said, studying the evidence. But how did you get access to this information? These are confidential banking records, internal communications from companies that aren't even public. Sarah had anticipated this question, but she still felt the weight of the decision she was about to make. Marcus, I need to tell you something about who I really am. He looked up from the tablet, and she saw wariness creep into his expression. I'm listening. I told you I used to work in corporate security, and that's true. But it wasn't for private companies. I worked for the government investigating financial crimes and international criminal networks. What kind of government work? Sarah took a deep breath. Intelligence work. I was a CIA operative specializing in financial crimes and corporate espionage. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, processing this revelation. CIA. You're a spy. I was a spy. I retired 3 months ago after a mission went wrong, but my former handler contacted me about your situation because they suspected you might be involved in money laundering for international criminals. They suspected me. I was assigned to investigate you and determine if you were guilty. But Marcus, what I found is that you're not the criminal, you're the target. Someone is using your company's collapse to launder money and create evidence that will frame you for crimes you didn't commit. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. So you've been investigating me this whole time. Everything, the job, helping Emma, all of it. It was just an assignment. The hurt in his voice cut through Sarah like a blade. It started as an assignment. But Marcus, I need you to understand, I quit my job today. I told my handler that I wouldn't complete the investigation because I know you're innocent. I'm risking my career and possibly my life because I believe in you and Emma. Why? Marcus turned back to face her. Why would you do that for people you barely know? Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time in years. Because in the past 3 weeks, you and Emma have given me something I didn't even know I was missing. You've given me a family, and I'll be damned if I let anyone destroy that. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out at the city lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. So, what do we do now? How do we stop them? We fight back. We gather evidence, we expose Morrison and his network, and we make sure they can't hurt you or Emma ever again. And if they come after us? Sarah met his eyes directly. Then they'll have to go through me first. And Marcus, I'm very good at what I do. Marcus nodded slowly, and Sarah saw something change in his expression. Not just acceptance, but determination. Then let's do this. Let's take down the people who destroyed my family. As they began planning their strategy for exposing Morrison's criminal network, Sarah realized that she'd finally found something worth fighting for. Not orders from handlers or abstract concepts of national security, but this man and his daughter who had somehow become the most important people in her world. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since Prague, Sarah felt like she was on the right side. The plan Sarah and Marcus devised was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. They would use Marcus as bait to draw James Morrison into revealing the full scope of his criminal operation, while Sarah gathered evidence that could expose the entire network to law enforcement. What they didn't anticipate was how quickly Morrison would realize he was being investigated. The warning came at 3 in the morning, when Sarah's secure phone buzzed with an emergency alert from Director Hayes. Abort mission. Extract immediately. Your cover is blown. Sarah was instantly awake, her training kicking in as she processed the implications. If Morrison knew she was investigating him, then Marcus and Emma were in immediate danger. Criminal organizations didn't leave loose ends, and they certainly didn't allow witnesses to their money laundering operations to testify. She moved quickly through the penthouse, checking security systems and escape routes, while her mind calculated their options. They could run. She had contacts who could provide new identities and safe transportation out of the country, but running would mean abandoning any chance of clearing Marcus's name or recovering his company, and it would mean spending the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. The sound of Emma's frightened cry from her bedroom made the decision for her. Sarah found Marcus already in Emma's room, holding his daughter while she sobbed about a nightmare involving bad men who wanted to hurt Daddy. The child's terror was so specific and visceral that Sarah realized Emma had somehow sensed the danger surrounding them, the way children sometimes understood threats that adults tried to hide. We need to leave, Sarah said quietly, meeting Marcus's eyes over Emma's head. Now. What's happened? Morrison knows we're onto him. My handler sent an abort signal, which means someone leaked information about our investigation. Marcus's face went pale. Emma, sweetheart, we're going to play a game, okay? We're going to pretend we're secret agents, and we need to pack very quickly and quietly. To Sarah's amazement, Emma stopped crying and nodded seriously. Like the astronauts when they have to leave their spaceship? Exactly like that. Can you be very brave for Daddy? As they quickly packed essential items, Sarah's tactical mind was already working through their situation. Morrison's criminal network had resources and connections that made a simple escape complicated. They needed somewhere safe to regroup, and they needed evidence strong enough to take down the entire operation before Morrison could eliminate them as threats. The solution came from an unexpected source. As they prepared to leave the penthouse, Marcus's phone rang with a call from his former assistant, Jenny, who had been laid off when the company collapsed. Mr. Bennett, Jenny's voice was urgent and frightened, you need to know, Mr. Morrison called me tonight. He wanted to know if you'd been asking questions about the old company files. He offered me money to report on anything unusual you might be doing. Marcus put the call on speaker so Sarah could hear. What did you tell him? I told him I hadn't heard from you since the layoffs, But Mr. Bennett, he scared me. He said things about making sure you understood the consequences of interfering with his business interests. Sarah took the phone. Jenny, this is Sarah Chen. I work with Marcus now. Did Morrison say anything else? He mentioned something about tomorrow being a decisive day and how problems sometimes solved themselves. Mr. Bennett, I think he's planning something terrible. After the call ended, Sarah and Marcus looked at each other with the grim understanding that they were out of time for subtle investigation. Morrison was moving against them, which meant they needed to act first. There's one option, Sarah said slowly. We turn the trap around. Instead of running, we make Morrison come to us on our terms. That sounds incredibly dangerous. It is. But Marcus, if we run now, Morrison wins everything. He keeps the money. He keeps your company's assets, and he probably finds a way to have you arrested for the crimes he committed. Sometimes the only way out is through. Marcus looked at Emma, who was clutching her stuffed rabbit and watching their conversation with the solemn attention of a child who knew her world was changing in ways she couldn't understand. What would it involve? Sarah outlined her plan, a high-stakes gambit that would require Marcus to meet with Morrison while wearing a wire, gathering the evidence they needed to expose the entire criminal network. It was risky, but it was also their only chance to end this permanently. If something goes wrong, Marcus said quietly, if Morrison realizes what we're doing, then I'll make sure Emma is safe, and I'll make sure Morrison pays for what he's done to your family. As dawn broke over Manhattan, they prepared for what would either be their salvation or their destruction. Sarah checked her weapons and surveillance equipment, while Marcus practiced the conversation that would either clear his name or get them all killed. Emma, with the resilience of childhood, had turned their desperate situation into an adventure, chattering excitedly about being secret agents on an important mission. Neither Sarah nor Marcus had the heart to tell her how real the danger was. The meeting was set for noon in Morrison's office. As Marcus prepared to walk into what might be a trap, Sarah realized that somewhere along the way, protecting this family had become more important to her than her own life. She just hoped it wouldn't come to that choice. The recording device, hidden in Marcus's jacket, caught every word of James Morrison's confession. Confident that he held all the cards and that Marcus was completely defeated, Morrison had been remarkably forthcoming about his criminal enterprise. He detailed how he'd coordinated with international money laundering operations, how he'd systematically destroyed Marcus's company, and how he'd planned to frame Marcus for the very crimes Morrison himself had committed. What Morrison didn't know was that Sarah was monitoring the conversation from a van parked outside the building, simultaneously coordinating with FBI agents who had surrounded the office complex. Director Hayes had been true to his word. When Sarah presented him with evidence of Morrison's criminal network, he'd mobilized a joint task force to take down the entire operation. You always were too trusting, Marcus, Morrison was saying, his voice clear through Sarah's earpiece. Even now you probably think this is about business competition. You have no idea how much money flows through operations like this. Your little tech company was just a convenient front for cleaning funds from drug cartels and arms dealers. Why frame me? Marcus asked, staying remarkably calm despite the danger. You could have just bought my assets when the company failed naturally. Morrison laughed, the sound cold and calculating. Because you're the perfect fall guy. Desperate CEO facing bankruptcy and custody battles? When this operation eventually gets exposed, and they always do eventually, you'll take the blame while I disappear with clean money and legitimate business assets. It was exactly the confession they needed. Sarah gave the signal, and FBI agents moved in simultaneously from multiple entrances. Within minutes, Morrison and 3 of his associates were in custody, while federal investigators began seizing financial records that would unravel the entire money laundering network. The next few hours passed in a blur of debriefings, legal proceedings, and coordination with international law enforcement agencies tracking Morrison's criminal connections. By evening, the immediate threat was over, but Sarah knew the legal proceedings would take months to resolve completely. She found Marcus in the penthouse's living room, sitting on the floor with Emma, while they rebuilt her stuffed animal kingdom. The little girl seemed remarkably unaffected by the day's drama, more interested in explaining the complex political relationships between Princess Bear and Captain Lion than in understanding why Daddy had been gone all afternoon. It's over? Marcus asked quietly. The immediate danger is over. Morrison and his associates are in federal custody, and the evidence we gathered will put them away for a very long time. Your name will be cleared, and you should be able to recover your company's assets." Marcus closed his eyes, and Sarah saw the tension he'd been carrying for months finally begin to leave his shoulders. "I can hardly believe it. This morning I thought we might have to disappear forever. This morning we almost did have to disappear forever. If Morrison had moved faster, if his people had found us before we were ready, but they didn't," Emma interjected seriously. "Because Sarah protected us. She's like a real superhero, except she doesn't wear a cape." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I'm not a superhero, sweetheart. I'm just someone who cares about you and your daddy very much." "Are you going to stay with us now?" Emma asked, with the direct honesty that only children possessed. "Now that the bad people are gone." Sarah looked at Marcus, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. The crisis that had brought them together was over, but that didn't automatically answer the question of what came next. "I'd like to stay," Sarah said carefully. "If your daddy thinks that would be okay." Marcus reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Sarah, these past few weeks have been the hardest and the best of my life. You didn't just save my company or clear my name. You gave me back my daughter, and you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope. The belief that good things can happen, that people can be trusted, that families can heal and grow." He paused, studying her face. "I know your life is complicated, and I know you have a career and obligations I don't fully understand. But if you're willing to take a chance on us—" "Marcus, I gave up my career for you and Emma. I chose this family over everything else I thought mattered. If you'll have me, there's nowhere else I'd rather be." Emma clapped her hands with delight. "So Sarah gets to stay forever, and we can build rockets and have tea parties and be a real family." "If Sarah wants to, then yes," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "We can be a real family." 3 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of their new home, a house in Westchester with a backyard big enough for rocket launches and elaborate tea parties. Marcus's company had been restored to him with additional damages awarded for the corporate sabotage, but he decided to restructure it with a focus on family-friendly policies and ethical business practices. Emma burst through the back door with dirt on her knees and excitement in her voice. "Sarah, Daddy, the rocket went so high I couldn't even see it anymore." "Did you remember to pack the parachute?" Sarah asked, wiping Emma's hands with a damp towel. "Of course. Daddy taught me that good engineers always plan for safe landings." Marcus appeared in the doorway, looking more relaxed and genuinely happy than Sarah had ever seen him. "Speaking of safe landings," he said, pulling Sarah into his arms while Emma giggled at their display of affection, "I think we've all found ours." As they prepared dinner together, a chaotic, joyful process involving Emma's detailed commentary on proper vegetable cutting techniques, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed. She'd given up a career in espionage for something far more dangerous and infinitely more rewarding. A real family, built on truth and trust and the kind of love that was worth protecting at any cost. Outside, the evening sky was clear enough to see the first stars appearing, and Emma was already making plans for their next rocket launch. Sarah had traded a life of secrets and danger for this, ordinary moments filled with extraordinary love. It was the best trade she'd ever made. In the end, the most important mission of her life hadn't been about saving companies or exposing criminals. It had been about learning that some families were worth everything, and that sometimes the greatest courage was simply choosing to stay.